Hello and welcome everybody to another installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. We're always grateful to have you with us on these regular Tuesday night slots. I'm your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross. I work for BirdLife South Africa's Landscape Conservation Program, and Sam is one of my absolutely incredible team members who is joining us tonight. Samantha Ralston-Paton is our Birds and Renewable Energy Project Manager. Now, Sam is coming to us from Van Wyksdorp in the Western Cape, the Karoo. So to avoid any technical glitches, we've pre-recorded Sam's actual presentation, but Sam is with us live, and she will be answering some of your questions at the end of the talk. So if you do have any, please fire them through, and Sam will handle those at the end of her presentation. So Sam, welcome. Please will you tell us a little bit about yourself, and I will get your presentation loaded so long.
Great. Thanks so much, Melissa. Welcome, everybody. I'm really pleased and a little bit nervous to be here. As Melissa said, where I'm based in the little Karoo, our internet is sometimes a little bit dodgy, so I thought it would be a safer option to record the presentation. It was recorded live, and I can assure you it was no less nerve-wracking. So I've been with BirdLife South Africa for since 2012, and my job is really to make sure that wind energy and solar energy develops with minimal harm to the environment, which means I often feel a little bit schizophrenic. I spend a lot of time convincing wind farm developers that birds are a serious problem at wind farms and we need to do something about it. And then I spend a lot of time convincing people who don't want to see wind energy in their landscape that actually there are worse options out there. So I hope you bear with me through my presentation as I kind of go through the process of unraveling all the facts and fictions and then try to come to some sort of conclusion. Over to me.
Great, thanks Sam. Here we go, enjoy everybody.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am both excited and a little bit nervous for tonight. I am nervous because this is a new format for me presenting in, but I'm also really excited. I'm looking forward to having some interesting conversations with you all at the end of my presentation. So before we get into the exciting bits, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with regards to what we mean by wind energy and what a wind turbine looks like and what a wind farm is. So I've got a picture up here of a typical modern wind turbine. These generate electricity by converting the wind's kinetic energy into mechanical energy, which by turning the turbines, and that is then converted into electricity, which is normally fed into our national grid. A single turbine is at the moment around 100 meters to hub height. That's around 30 stories high. And the turbine blades themselves are around 60 meters long. And we are seeing each year these things are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The average 3 megawatt wind turbine can produce enough power to support around 3,300 homes. That's based on average South African household consumption and the average amount of power generated by a typical turbine in South Africa. Combined, a whole bunch of wind turbines are commonly called a wind farm, or more formally called a wind energy facility. In South Africa, we have quite ambitious targets for wind energy. Our latest energy roadmap has set a target of 17,700 megawatts from wind energy by 2030. Now, if you're not really in the wind energy industry, this probably doesn't mean very much to you. But based on the current size of turbines in South Africa, we can expect to see around 3,500 wind turbines by 2030. South Africa and the rest of Africa has certainly been lagging far behind the rest of the world, for example, China, Europe, and North America when it comes to installed wind energy capacity. But things are changing. South Africa is leading the continent, but we're seeing a lot of wind power generated in North and East Africa as well. And the graph on the right here just shows a steady year-on-year increase with installed energy capacity in Africa. So I like to think of wind energy a bit like Marmite. People either love it or they hate it. And that makes my life quite interesting. People love wind energy. People who love energy see it as a symbol of the future, of hope, a cleaner, better environment. So much so that I understand some people even have their wedding photos taken at wind farms, which is an interesting backdrop. On the other hand, some people hate wind energy. They see it as a blot on the landscape. They don't believe that these industrial scale infrastructure has any place in our landscapes. They think these things need to be stopped simply. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I'm not going to unpack all of these, but this is really where birds come in. And this hate for wind farms has made some unlikely conservationists in the world, most notably everybody's favorite person, Donald Trump, who likes to be in the news these days for making interesting scientific statements. One of these is that wind farms are a bird graveyard. He suggests that if you go under a wind turbine, you will see more birds, assuming dead birds, than you've ever seen in your life. He is very vocal about wind energy. But it's not just him. You get organizations like Save the Eagles International, which claim that wind farms will cause the extinction of many bird and bat species. And to be honest, there are plenty of myths and misconceptions about how birds are affected, both from proponents of wind energy, but also opponents of wind energy. It's both sides of the fence have some interesting perceptions of the facts. So what I'm going to do tonight is unpack some of the more common myths and misconceptions that I've come across during my time working at BirdLife South Africa. The first myth is because wind energy is clean, in other words, it doesn't emit any emissions or very little pollution, it must be green, right? Well, certainly compared to coal-fired power stations, wind energy is a lot greener. And it's important to bear in mind that at the moment, 68% of South Africa's electricity comes from coal. We are one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. Not only does this have significant impacts in terms of climate change mitigation, it has severe impacts on human health and well-being. It negatively affects our water resources and most certainly quite a blot on our landscape if that's something that you worry about as well. So in comparison, wind energy looks quite great, but it is by no means environmentally neutral. Wind energy facilities, as I mentioned earlier, the wind turbines themselves are pretty large. They need quite a significant footprint. They require a wide network of roads that generally span quite a significant portion of a landscape, which means that there's habitat loss potentially and fragmentation. The construction and operation of wind farms can cause ongoing disturbance of sensitive species. It is associated with infrastructure, not just the roads. You have associated power lines, which in themselves can impact birds that collide with the power lines. But the thing people seem to worry most about, the most direct impact, is that birds can be killed if they collide with the rapidly moving turbine blades. So while, like Marmite, wind energy is a healthier option, perhaps we need to consider everything in moderation. So wind energy is greener, but it would be stretching things to say that it's entirely green. So I like to say that terms and conditions apply, and I'm going to unpack some of those terms and conditions as we go through the evening. The next myth is that wind turbines are efficient bird killing machines. Something along the lines that President Donald Trump was suggesting, that if you go beneath a wind turbine, you're going to see hundreds of dead birds. Other people believe that just simply because a bird occurs in an area where wind turbines are, that they are automatically going to be killed. This is not true. In South Africa, wind farms are obliged to monitor their impacts on birds. This work's done by independent specialists. And this data is then sent to BirdLife South Africa and we collate it. So we have a good picture of what's happening across all the wind farms in South Africa, and we can compare that between different wind farms in South Africa as well as the rest of the world. And this data is showing that at the moment, we can expect that bird specialists will find around 1 bird carcass beneath a turbine per year. That's hardly a mass bird graveyard that some people expect. However, it is really important to remember that a single carcass doesn't mean that just 1 bird was in fact killed. The people searching for carcasses have quite a difficult task. They have a big area to cover. They sometimes have quite tricky terrain, vegetation, which might cover where the carcasses are. The time period between carcass searching is also a challenge. Birds' carcasses could be removed by scavengers or simply decay to a point where they're no longer visible. So there's some careful experimental design and statistics that can be applied to get to an estimated figure of the actual number of birds that are killed. In South Africa, we're looking at an average of around 4.6 birds killed per turbine per year. If you convert that to per megawatt, that's around 2 birds per megawatt per year. And that's really a more useful figure to use if you're comparing it with other kinds of energy technology. So bird fatalities at wind energy facilities are a rare event. It's not often a bird specialist or somebody visiting a wind farm is going to see a bird collision, but it does happen. This beautiful bird here is being a martial eagle, and it's been held up by Dr. Rob Simmons, who was unfortunate enough to witness the bird colliding and slowly falling to the ground. And he's got an incredible series of pictures showing exactly what happened. So wind turbines are not efficient bird killing machines. Birds can show avoidance behavior, which I'll go into a little bit later. Their collisions are actually normally quite rare events, but as I will unpack, even rare events can be significant. This is a favorite one that a lot of proponents of wind energy like to quote. And I've even seen this variation or some variation of these statistics quoted by fairly reputable journalists and magazines. So people who like wind energy say, well, don't worry, more birds are killed by cats, cars, and windows. And while technically correct, I'm going to show why this isn't really a useful comparison. So bear with me for a second. I hope you'll all agree that in the green circle, the icons represent a whole bunch of different kinds of mammals that we can get. So from rhinos to cats to mice to bats. And the blue circle represents a couple of different kinds of birds that we can get. By no means the entire diversity, but on the same page with me here. Now we know that naughty kitties are responsible for killing a lot of mice and rats. They're pretty efficient at that. They're also responsible for killing a lot of our garden birds and songbirds. Focusing on mammals for a second, we're all hopefully aware that rhino poaching poses a significant threat to rhinos, and it's something that conservationists are directing a lot of resources to. So while it's technically correct to say that more mammals are killed by cats than poaching, nobody's going to suggest that that's a good reason not to worry about rhino poaching. And the same really applies to birds. It's not very useful to compare a pigeon with a vulture. We need to look at which species are being affected and which species are, more importantly, threatened with extinction or already threatened with extinction and having added pressure from these naughty kitties or from wind farms. So while it is technically correct to say that more birds are killed by cats than wind turbines, it's not very useful. Lumping species really doesn't tell us very much about how we should be prioritizing our conservation action. And if we look at the types of bird carcasses that are found beneath turbines in South Africa, the data is suggesting that around 36% of all bird carcasses found beneath those turbines are of raptors, so your birds of prey. You're looking at eagles, jackal buzzards, and sometimes even in vultures. Not adjusting for that searcher efficiency and scavenger removal, which probably isn't as high as it is for other groups of species, we can expect that around one bird of prey is going to be killed for every 4 turbines that operate over a period of a year. The actual figure is probably quite a bit higher than that. So if we look at that 17,700 target by 2030, based on current estimates, we can suggest that around 35,000 birds are likely to be killed by turbines every year in South Africa. That doesn't tell us very much, it's not very helpful. But if I tell you that around 1,500 raptors are going to be killed every year, perhaps it might make you sit up and think a bit, particularly if you sit back and think about how often you get to see these birds of prey in our environment. They're generally found at pretty low densities, and they play an important role in our ecosystems as apex predators. The kinds of birds that are being affected in South Africa so far, the kinds of species that we're particularly worried about when it comes to wind energy, include black harrier. It's an endemic species. It's only found in Southern Africa. It is endangered, and we have less than 1,000 mature individuals left. So at the moment, we're looking at a situation where we have almost 1% of the population that has already been affected by wind energy. Burroughs eagle, also known as black eagle, another species that's been affected in, although relatively low numbers, certainly we are concerned, particularly given the significant overlap with areas of really good resource in the parts of the central Karoo. And vultures, we all know that vultures are already facing a major conservation crisis. And there's a significant overlap with good wind resource and socioeconomic need for wind energy development in parts of the Eastern Cape where they're coming into conflict with wind turbines. So while it is technically correct to say that more birds are killed by cats, cars and windows, I hope I've convinced you that lumping all birds together into one group is not really helpful. It's much more helpful to be looking at which kinds of species are affected and is it significant for the conservation of that species. And even if all species were equal, it's important to bear in mind that we are looking ahead into the future and we can expect to see more and more wind energy installed in South Africa, in Africa and across the globe. And this doesn't take away from the current threats that the birds are facing. So agriculture, habitat loss, cats, birds and buildings are already putting pressure on our natural environment. And adding to this, we now have this new potential threat to birds from the expansion of wind energy resulting in cumulative impacts. So it's not really useful just to look at sheer numbers and claim that one thing's more important than another. We need to look to the future and see what are the new threats that are coming down the line. And by way of example of these cumulative impacts, South Africa, or Southern Africa, has a population of bearded vultures, which is in a little bit of trouble at the moment in the Lesotho-Drakensberg area. Some work has been done by Ian Rushworth and Sonia Kruger, where they've done what's called a population viability analysis, which is the graph on the left, which basically models what the population is expected to do into the future. On the x-axis here, we have the years, and on the y-axis, we have the population size. And each line is basically a different scenario that's been run. And what this graph tells us is that the population is already in trouble. We can estimate that between around 100 years and 500 years, that the population is at risk of going extinct. So that's the local population. They've then added to this the effect of just 80 wind turbines in Lesotho. And their models show that this will almost certainly accelerate the local extinction of the population to 50 to 100 years' time. So even rare events can matter. So we know that lumping birds together is not very helpful, and impacts are generally cumulative on species. Another myth that comes across my desk is that only raptors, birds of prey, and other large soaring or migratory species are affected by wind energy. And yes, raptors are definitely a significant portion of the carcasses found beneath turbines. They are by no means the only species that are affected. That blue portion of the pie there is made up of a whole suite of species in South Africa, from swifts to game birds, doves, pigeons, and even flufftails. In fact, our data shows that a whopping 130 species have been killed by turbine collisions in South Africa so far. And what we did is we looked at the species that were potentially exposed to the risk of turbine collisions. So that is birds that were recorded during impact assessments and monitoring at the wind energy facility itself, as well as the species that have been recorded in bird atlasing in the broader area. And we found that of those species likely to be found in an area, at least 30% have been shown up as a fatality at wind farms so far. And our monitoring's only been happening in South Africa for a few years, so we can expect the number of species to increase. And so we have estimated that 42% of birds exposed to risk are likely to be affected by collisions in some way, which is something not everybody thinks about when they think about impact assessments for wind energy facilities. But it's important to note that just because a bird is killed, although it's significant for that individual bird, certainly it's not necessarily significant for conservation of that species. Interesting enough, this little guy here, Book McCary, is one of the more common carcasses found beneath turbines, which is perhaps because he's pretty visible, easy to see, but it's certainly not something that we initially expected in impact assessments. And while common species might not be at conservation risk due to wind energy, it does point to the fact that we need to be more cautious when it comes to rarer species. So, for example, quite a number of this little guy, red-capped lark, have been found beneath turbines. Not threatened, but we do have a number of range-restricted and threatened species in South Africa that we now know that we need to be concerned about, particularly in the breeding season where they display, which puts them at risk of turbine collisions because they're suddenly in the area where the turbines are sweeping. Another example is the white-winged flufftail. Fortunately, we haven't had any white-winged flufftail fatalities at wind farms so far. It is one of the world's rarest birds. It's critically endangered. And we've been fairly precautionary when it comes to advising wind farms that are proposed near white-winged flufftail habitat. But now that we know that other flufftails are coming up as fatalities, we're fairly confident that these guys are going to be at risk. So we need to make sure that wind farms aren't built anywhere near their habitat. Something wind energy developers often ask me is, well, when birds just learned to avoid wind turbines? Oh, if only that were true. Unfortunately, I don't think there are many learning opportunities for birds when it comes to colliding with turbines. Collisions are normally fatal, but some groups of birds do show avoidance behavior. This is a picture taken from a study done in 2005 of migratory water birds. The dark lines are flight paths that have been depicted using radar. The little red dots are the location of offshore wind turbines. And what you can see from this graph is that, or not this picture, is that birds generally do avoid flying too close to the turbine. So they're showing some sort of avoidance. And this is very dependent on the species involved. Some species show macro avoidance, so they avoid the wind farm area entirely or almost entirely, which is great in terms of reducing collision risk. But if that wind farm is also located in important foraging habitat, it does mean that they have lost that habitat effectively. It's no longer available for the birds to use. It could also mean that there's an injected cost if birds are now having to fly past a huge area of turbines to get to somewhere that they want to go. Other species show what's called micro-avoidance. They don't show any clear avoidance of the wind farm itself, but they do show behavior that indicates that they're aware of and try to avoid flying into the turbine blades themselves. But then you get some birds like bustards and vultures, which have a particular problem. They are effectively blind in the direction that they are flying in. So this picture of a vulture here, it has a narrow area of binocular vision just above and in front of the bill. All other areas represented by blue here, they are effectively blind. So when they're flying, they're looking down at the ground where they can see to the side, but they are possibly quite unaware of these large structures looming in their flight path. So yes, some birds do avoid wind farms and wind turbines, but by no means all. So it's not a matter of birds will just learn and become used to these things. So some attitude by some parts of government and developers is that, well, let's just get these wind farms up and running. We have an urgent need for electricity and we can deal with any bird problems later. Well, in South Africa, we have this embedded in our legislation, our environmental legislation, but it's also part of international best practice in terms of assessing and avoiding impact. This is called the mitigation hierarchy. And in the context of wind farms, this means that the first thing we need to do is avoid impacts. For wind farms, this means avoiding placing turbines or the wind farm itself where they are likely to present a significant risk to birds. So it could mean avoiding placing a wind farm in an important flyaway or near a wetland, or making sure that turbines are a substantial distance away from important nesting or roosting sites. Avoidance really is the best and most effective way to make sure that you minimize impacts or avoid impacts entirely. The next option is to minimize impacts. This can be done through curtailment, so stopping wind turbines from operating during high-risk seasons or high-risk periods of the day. You could also shut turbines down during periods when birds are visibly seen in the area, either using technology or human observers. And there's also a suggestion that we could dissuade birds from entering wind farms, for example, using acoustic deterrence. The first two options, curtailment and shutdown demand, sound attractive, but we must be honest, they come at quite a significant cost in terms of technology and manpower. There's also the cost in terms of the wind turbines not going to be generating power when the turbines are not turning. So this brings a lot of uncertainty for developers and for project financiers. In South Africa, as in much of the rest of the world, the concern with shutdown on demand and curtailment is that there's a need for effective independent oversight and enforcement to ensure that this happens. In South Africa, we don't have a system of fining developers for any fatalities that might happen, so that there might not be a real incentive to make sure that they do shut down turbines voluntarily. When it comes to dissuasion, you ask any farmer, they'll tell you that it might work temporarily, emitting a loud noise, but birds are pretty smart and they can generally become habituated to types of noise. So it might be a temporary solution, but not necessarily a long-term solution. The next option is to restore or rehabilitate habitat that's been affected. This is a little bit trickier to implement when it comes to addressing bird fatalities, but certainly we could manage habitat outside a wind energy facility to attract birds away from the site and improve the habitat elsewhere. And the next option is to offset or compensate for any habitat loss or fatalities that could involve significant sort of conservation action to benefit the species otherwise. But in order of preference, desirability, the most effective, the least risk option is really to avoid impacts by putting wind farms and wind turbines in the right place. So no, we can't just let wind farms be built and deal with problems later. This introduces an enormous amount of risk and uncertainty, both for the wind farms, financial risk and financial uncertainty, and for the environment, because we need to make sure that if we did go that route, we had effective solutions and that we had effective enforcement if we did implement that. Some people seem to suggest that there are no other alternatives, that some of these issues are just an evil we have to live with. So that wind energy is better than coal, so we just got to suck it up and do what we need to do. That's not really true. There are an increasing number of alternatives. We have solar energy is also, the prices plummeted, like with wind energy. It's becoming a feasible option both for utility, large-scale photovoltaic facilities similar to wind energy facilities, as well as smaller scale distributed power. For example, we're seeing an increasing number of PV panels on shopping centres, in parking lots, etc., which will certainly have a much lower environmental impact. There are also other things that we can do. For example, we can all save energy and implement other measures to reduce our carbon footprint. So we at BirdLife are not saying that, no, we don't need wind energy. We believe that there are many options available, and it's all about putting the right technology in the right place. There's some environments that wind energy is completely acceptable, but there are other places where we believe that the environmental risks are just too high. So even if you love it, much like Marmite, context matter. Nobody, even I hope the strongest proponents of wind energy are going to propose turbines on the top of Table Mountain. And from a bird conservation perspective, we hope that nobody in their right mind is going to propose turbines right next to a vulture colony, for example. Then there's this thing about climate change, and some people seem to believe that because climate change is so much of a bigger threat than, for example, habitat loss, or climate change is such a big threat to human health and well-being that everything pales in comparison, and we just need to focus all our energy on addressing climate change, and then the rest we'll just have to deal with. Now, depending on your perspective, some people are wildlife-centric, who believe in preservation of wildlife just for the sake of wildlife. And if this is your perspective, it's important to remember that, yes, climate change is a significant threat to biodiversity, but so is habitat loss and overexploitation. These remain amongst the biggest threat to many species. If you have a more human-centric perspective, perhaps it would be useful to remind you that healthy ecosystems protect us from the impacts of climate change. For example, rivers buffer against storms and floods, and birds are an integral part of these ecosystems. We need healthy ecosystems to protect us from the impacts of climate change. So healthy ecosystem conservation and climate change mitigation and adaptations are really two sides of the same coin. We don't have the luxury of choosing between the two. We really need to address both issues together. So what is BirdLife South Africa doing about all of this? Well, we help bring facts to the debate, much like I'm doing today. And our aim is to ensure that decisions are based on the best available science. So we influence policy, we develop guidelines to bring together the latest research. We collate data, for example, some of the data that we've presented to you today. We really encourage the sharing of information and lessons learned between practicing specialists and decision makers, and essentially provide support and advice to all stakeholders. So one of my favorite things to do is to help wind farm developers screen potential sites for development. It's so much easier to dissuade a wind farm developer from investing in a site in the early days rather than right at the end of the process when they've already invested millions and millions into impact assessment and agreements with landowners. So we assist developers unpack issues during site screening, but we also assist people who are looking to oppose particular wind farms to help them understand the issues related to birds. And sometimes birds are a significant issue at that particular site, and sometimes they're not. So we provide information to help them understand those issues. So essentially, we promote the responsible development of renewable energy in South Africa. So if you're interested and you want to know more, you can visit our website, www.birdlife.org.za. You can drop me an email, energy@birdlife.org.za, or you can also follow me on Twitter, which is @SamRalston-Paton. Just want to acknowledge the generous sponsorship of our project by Investec. They've supported our project since 2012, and we're incredibly grateful for that. They've been great partners. A lot of our data analysis has been supported by the Fitzpatrick Institute at the University of Cape Town. The Wildlife and Endangered Trust have also been great in terms of developing and implementing best practice guidelines. Our work is supported by a huge range of specialists and experts. Also need to acknowledge the South African Wind Energy Association, who are important critics and partners of ours, as is the Department of Environmental Affairs. Thank you very much. Look forward to some interesting questions from you all now.
Great, thank you so much, Sam. That was absolutely phenomenal. We really do appreciate you bringing all the facts to the debate and teaching everyone about the incredible birds and renewable energy work that you've been up to for the last while. Before we jump into some questions, we've got just a few things to let everyone know. If you exit the webinar this evening, you'll see that there is a survey. It takes about a minute to complete. If you wouldn't mind just filling in some info for us, that'll help us keep developing these webinars and bringing you a great event every evening. And then as well, if you are joining us next week, the webinar is going to be hosted by myself and Dr. Lucy Kemp. We'll be talking all things Bird of the Year, and really, really excited to discuss these wonderful southern ground hornbills with Lucy. You also see on your screen that there is a small Quicket scan code. If you'd like to support these webinars, please do pop over to Quicket on the website there or scan the code. Every little penny helps us, and we really do appreciate everybody's support in bringing you these weekly webinars. Now, Sam, I see we've had quite a few questions, and thank you for answering some of them while we've been going. But just to answer some live on the air, I see Dr. Rob Simmons is tuned in and is chatting about possible blade marking. We had one or two questions linked to that, making these blades more visible. Can you elaborate a bit on this whole concept of making blades more visible for us, please?
Yes, yeah, that's something that was proposed in South Africa. Sure, before I even joined BirdLife South Africa, was to increase the visibility of the turbine blades. And we were initially told that, well, it's not possible to go down that route because the Civil Aviation Association does not allow that. And there's surprisingly little research that's been done on that to prove whether it's effective or not. And because there's no evidence to show that it, well, wasn't any evidence to show that it is effective, it's not something we pushed very hard. But a couple of years ago, we came across some work that's being done in a very problematic wind farm called Smola in Norway, where they've been experimenting with painting one of the 3 turbine blades black. Still, it's a small wind farm where they have problems with eagles. The results, as far as I understand, haven't been published in a peer-reviewed journal, but certainly quite promising results from that. And we're quite excited to test it in South Africa. There are a couple of technical challenges we need to get through, including the Civil Aviation Association, but verbally they're saying it's something they would consider. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we will be testing it in South Africa, and it could prove to be a really nice low cost solution, much cheaper than, for example, implementing shutdown on demand. But let's wait and see what happens.
Certainly, no, I think there's lots of scope to look at those different color variations. And I see here one of our honorary patrons, Pamela Isdell, has tuned in and asked, why are the turbines white? Is there any particular reason that they've always been white? Is that just a manufacturing thing, or do you know if there's a reason for that white color?
I am going to go out on a limb. I don't have a definitive answer to that. I suspect it's partly Civil Aviation Authority requirements. I suspect also it could be due to the perceived reduced visual impact. As I mentioned earlier, some people don't like the visual impact of wind turbines in the landscape, and darker wind turbines could be more visible in certain circumstances. I do know that we've got a couple of members from the Wind Energy Association online. I wonder if they could maybe help us answer that.
Sure thing, yes. If any of our friends from SWIA or elsewhere would like to type in some answers in the chat room, we can definitely bring those to everyone's attention. We've got a question on Facebook, Sam, asking, John is asking, how do you monitor your turbines to reduce fatalities of birds?
Okay, so monitoring is done for various reasons. Firstly, monitoring is done to actually see how many birds are killed, not once you are sure that there is a problem. Then information on how birds are moving through, which your most problematic turbines are that you could, for example, shut down on demand.
Great. And then we've got a question here asking, what is the uptake and feasibility of vertical bladeless wind turbines? Is there any form of positive
yes,
or negative towards birds?
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about bird-friendly turbines. So the vertical bladeless wind turbines are one option. I got asked another question about a sort of more conical shaped one. You also, you get a whole bunch of different designs. The big problem is that we haven't been able to scale those turbines up to produce anywhere near the amount of power that a single, for example, 3 megawatt turbine produces. So while those smaller bladeless turbines are great in a sort of domestic environment, maybe on a building or to generate power for anywhere near the amount of power that a sort of traditional utility scale wind farm produces. But hopefully we'll get to a point where that changes, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how technology develops over the years.
Absolutely, and I see Lance Blaine has said that it is a CAA requirement, and that is why the blades are white. So thank you, Lance, for that. There's
Thanks, Lance.
A question here from Kevin saying, an interesting project focusing on offsetting bird impacts from wind farms is the Greater Crom, sorry, my question was just disappeared. Greater Crom Stewardship Project in the Jeffreys Bay region of the Eastern Cape. Sam, you've had some involvement in this, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of the offsetting done there.
Yes, I'm not sure whether it's correct to frame that as a biodiversity offset. It was an initiative certainly started due to interested and affected parties concerned about the cumulative impacts of wind energy in that area. The Greater Crom Trust opposed a number of wind farms, and as a result, wind farms came together and developed this initiative where they developed a conservation plan for the area, and as they came online, they contributed to conservation stewardship. They've had phenomenal success, and I would love to see that model replicated in other areas. The only challenge is that the real driver for that initiative was a situation of quite intense conflict. It would be great if wind farms could voluntarily come together to promote better biodiversity impacts in the areas that they're developing. But hopefully, again, there's some good stirrings to come in parts of the country.
Awesome. Now, I see one of our colleagues, Andrew de Block, has tuned in, and he's got a good question for you, Sam. He's saying he's very interested to get your take on the recent statements by government that they're looking at converting decommissioned coal mines to wind or solar energy. He wants to know, are there EIAs necessary for these? Are they bypassed because they are pre-disturbed sites? And it seems logical that with wind farms, these wind farms would pose different threats and would require fresh assessment for suitability.
Yeah, it's something I'm super excited to see. I stand to be corrected, but I imagine that they will still need to do an environmental impact assessment because of the way that the legislation is framed at the moment. It is possible that those areas could be marked as what's called renewable energy development zones, where development is I want to say fast track, but certainly they don't need to go through as rigorous process as a full environmental impact assessment. But yes, I think it's a brilliant idea. I'm not sure whether the wind resource is that great in many parts of the country, but certainly the solar energy, it just makes so much sense, and it also makes a lot of sense in terms of ensuring the people who are going to be losing jobs due to coal mines and coal-fired power stations being shut down do have some sort of income. It's the way to go.
Brilliant. Then Eleanor Mary is asking, do the developers of wind turbine farms have to undertake environmental impact assessments before selecting a location? And she's saying presumably wind is a more erratic source of power than solar, which we would seem to have in abundance.
Yes, so the wind resources certainly concentrated in the western parts of the country and Northern Cape, whereas our solar resources generally good over most of our country. Sorry, I'm trying to remember, do they need to do an environmental impact assessment before selecting the site? Yes. Generally, by the time a developer goes through the environmental impact assessment, they already have a site selected. And so they've already invested a fair amount of work and money in that site. So the most effective is to have a really rigorous site screening, which happens before the EIA. It's a little bit of a strange process, but that's the situation we dealt with at the moment, which is why it's so important that we have good relationships with developers who trust our advice about where sites are good and where sites are not so good to invest in.
Yes, and then we've got one coming off the coal aspect again from Dale Steele saying, any data on coal impacts to bird health, habitat or prey? Would restoration of coal impacts be potential large offsets to wind energy impacts?
Sure. That's an interesting question. Look, I do know that there are studies, I don't think they're based in South Africa, about again, just the number of birds killed by different energy sources. It's a question of lumping birds together. Would it be an offset? Probably not, because we're looking at completely different environments and completely different birds. But that's not to say that it's not something that should happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. And obviously with all of our power generation comes a lot of infrastructure impacts. Things like your power lines being built to the farms and that sort of thing can also pose an impact, not just the turbines themselves. So we always need to be cognizant of that with our wildlife when we're building these things. I've got a question here from Robin Helenor asking, is the low pressure system created by a wind turbine fatal to small mammals, bats in particular, if they fly through this zone?
Again, I'm not an expert in pressure systems, but certainly the blades do cause an amount of turbulence. And initially, there were studies to suggest that bats were killed by what's called barotrauma. So essentially, the sudden change in pressure caused their lungs to, I'm not sure if it was implode or explode, but didn't do their lungs any good. Subsequent studies have shown, and I stand to be corrected, that actually collisions are a bigger issue, but certainly there is some turbulence and change of pressure there. Great. From what I understand.
Yes, leading off from that, Nico's asking, has the impact to birds and bats in terms of their populations been considered or approved upfront in government's recent approval of the 17, he's got megawatt 2020 target for the IRP?
So that's the Integrated Resources Plan, which is essentially South Africa's energy roadmap. No, when they, as far as I understand, when they identified those targets, I don't think environmental issues were really part of the consideration of the different technologies. But subsequent to that, South Africa has done strategic environmental assessments for wind and solar energy, where they have identified areas that are preferred for wind and solar development, where the various environmental issues from impacts on biodiversity, birds, bats, you name it, has been considered. I'll probably add here that we're not in full support of the first round of the strategic environmental assessment. We think they could have done a better job, but yeah, we'll move on from there.
Well, I think leading off of that, Dion Brand's asking, what is the level of government expertise when it comes to issues of EIAs and wind energy mitigation?
That's a good question. There's certainly a high level of, I think, of expertise when it comes to understanding the broader environmental issues associated with wind energy. But they do rely quite heavily on, they don't have in-house ornithological expertise, for example. So they do rely quite heavily on the likes of BirdLife South Africa and the consulting bird specialists to make sure bird issues, and similarly the bat fraternity, to make sure that issues relating to bats are properly raised and addressed.
Great. So Philip's asking, wind energy is often referred to as clean energy. He's got that in inverted commas.
Yeah.
How clean is the process of manufacturing these turbines? He's read some horror stories around mining rates of rare earth minerals, and are these also myths? I
am not going to be able to answer that. Again, I think I'd probably be better to refer you to the Wind Energy Association. Look, nobody's going to deny that the construction of turbines, like the construction of our cell phones, do have undesirable components. How that compares to other energy sources, I can't speak to. I have been asked a couple of times about the carbon emissions that are related to building wind turbines, because obviously constructing them and building them does have a carbon footprint. And the studies I've come across show that it on average takes around 6 months for that carbon debt to be paid off by the wind turbine. But when it comes to rare earths, I'm going to step away from that.
Great. So I see Steve Woodhull said to us that another reason the blades are white is because titanium dioxide is a good UV blocker, which helps preserve these blades under our harsh South African conditions. But Mary coming off of that is saying, life expectancy of these wind farms, do we know what it is? And how long is it before these blades are replaced? I'm not sure if you know, Sam.
So the expected lifespan of a wind farm is generally 20 years, as I understand it. What was the second part, sorry?
She was asking sort of the life expectancy of the farm. How long are we expecting?
About 20 years.
Super. Great. And then there's a question from John saying, are there moves towards demand management for electricity, i.e. reduce the demand so that more farms are not needed, especially when we waste so much electricity and there's such high potential for solar geysers to take away that aspect of demand?
Oh, again, I'll be talking a little bit out of my field of expertise. There's certainly a move I understand a lot of European countries are already implementing, and something that South Africa should be doing, but I couldn't answer any more than that.
Okay. Can intense solar panel sites affect birds in any way? This is from Pamela Isdell.
I'm not sure what she means by intense.
Your concentrated solar power facilities, possibly. Yes. Yeah.
So you get two different kinds of wind energy. You get your sort of traditional PV, photovoltaic wind solar farms, which are similar to the panels that we see on some people's homes, and there the impacts are primarily related to the habitat loss. You're looking at around 3 hectares on average that is potentially lost per megawatt at those facilities. Then you get something called concentrated solar power, which is a completely different technology, and essentially it concentrates the sun's energy into a single point, which heats up a heat transfer fluid, which then generates power. I'm not explaining this very well without diagram. But one of those concentrated solar power facilities, one of those technologies uses a central receiving tower, where hundreds of mirrors are reflecting up to a single point. And certainly there, birds can be killed if they fly through that intense concentrated section of solar energy. But there has been very little scientific research on that. And we would love to do some work at the one facility that is up and running near Uppington. I do understand that a thesis is imminent, and looking forward to reading that study.
Fantastic. Then I've got 2 questions. The first one's from Eleanor Mary, and she's asking, does the incredibly fast speed of the blades not act to suck the birds into their orbit? And Arno, on a similar vein, is asking, with the higher rotational velocity of the blades, Are the tips moving so quickly that they almost seem invisible to the birds at these high speeds?
As far as I understand, birds aren't necessarily sucked into the orbit, but it's more a question of them not perceiving the blades, which are moving so quickly. And as I understand it, the blades are at the tip can be moving around sort of 300 kilometers an hour. And then the second one was, sorry, I'm losing track of my questions.
So yeah, they were saying, can birds be sucked in, and then are they moving so quickly that they're invisible to birds?
That is certainly a theory. We quite honestly don't know, because we can't get into birds' heads to see what they see. But it is certainly, as I explained with the vulture, it's quite possible that some birds don't perceive the blades at all.
Yeah. Mike Lovell's asking, would it be feasible to promote some BirdLife identified suitable areas to wind farm developers that do not have big or significant negative environmental impacts to birds? I don't know if you want to elaborate on this.
That's a really good question, and I would love to be able to do that. At the moment, one of the challenges is often the areas that, if you look at the maps, come up as low sensitivity are often areas that just simply aren't properly surveyed. But my colleague Robin has been doing some incredible habitat suitability models for most of our threatened species in South Africa. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we will be able to certainly identify areas that are higher risk and areas that are probably lower risk from a bird perspective. But we do understand that birds are just one of the many, many issues that wind farm developers need to consider when identifying a suitable location for a wind farm.
Absolutely, and we're really looking forward to Robin's work, and hopefully in a future webinar we'll be able to bring some of his incredible modelling forward to all of you to enjoy as well. Now, Michael Piper is asking, what is the impact of wind turbines at sea versus land? Do the mortality figures presented tonight include seabirds? And if so, how would that be monitored, as birds would either sink or be pulled away by currents?
That's a very good question. In South Africa, we do not have any ocean-based wind turbines. And as far as I understand, it's going to be a long time before that happens. So the data that I presented was just data for South Africa. And yes, monitoring fatalities out at sea is much, much more challenging than monitoring the number of fatalities that happen on land. And those estimates of fatality rates are generally modeled and very hard to verify.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mary is asking, talking about turbine replacement and post-use waste or sort of turbine graveyards, are the current wind developers required to have some kind of plan in place to work beyond the lifespan of their wind farms? Do you have any idea what happens at the end of that wind farm's life?
I do not, and again, that's a really, really important question that I am going to field to the wind energy developers and wind energy association members that are tuned in. So hopefully they can answer that question. But yes, it's a good question.
Great, we've got a question from one of our very close colleagues at Eskom, Kashalan. Thanks for tuning in. He's asking, do we feel that the increase in wind energy facilities and associated infrastructure, so here we're talking roads and power lines, are causing certain bird species to start shifting ranges? And he's put an IE here, crows, martial eagles, etc.
Good question. I don't think wind energy facilities, not yet, although some birds, as I mentioned earlier, do show avoidance behavior. In South Africa, we don't have any data to indicate that. But yeah, impacts on crows, they could be increasing the expansion into areas following roads and power lines. But that's, again, Melissa, you're probably better at answering that question than I am.
Yeah, I mean, we have absolutely.
Yeah, so it's certainly more birds like martial eagles nesting on power lines creates an interesting challenge where they nesting in areas where they wouldn't normally be found if it weren't for those power lines, which marshal eagles are endangered, and it creates an interesting challenge for wind energy because they're also at risk of turbine collisions. But
yes, and
interesting.
yeah, our colleagues at EWT are doing some great work on the marshal eagles and power lines out in the Karoo, so looking forward to their results. John Yeld's got a question here asking, are there any WEF operations that are currently required to shut down during particular seasons or times? And if so, who's monitoring this, and are there the restrictions adhered to?
John, that's a really good question. At the moment, there's only one farm that I'm aware of that was voluntarily implementing some sort of shutdown on demand, although a lot of wind farms have agreed to it in the impact assessment processes. And there are some wind farms that are looking into it as an option, but well, yeah, not yet, but it's certainly going to come into it. Who monitors? The independent consultants who oversee the carcass searches would monitor whether that's happening and whether it's effective. And ultimately, it's up to the Department of Forestry and Fisheries to make sure that those conditions are enforced.
Great. Raymond's asking, what are your thoughts on conservation programs that help affected populations recover, for example, away from the WEF or the wind energy facility in high population regions with no turbines? So I'm not 100% sure if you're talking about people that have to necessarily move, or are we talking about birds here? So possibly looking at offset sites, I guess he's talking to here, Sam.
Yes, okay, so I think I understand the question. So if you're suggesting sort of offsetting the impacts of a wind energy facility, either by benefiting the population that's been impacted by sort of increasing the productivity of that population, or drawing birds away from the risk site, that's certainly something that needs to be considered if a wind farm is operational and shown to be problematic. But it's not something we would encourage is considered during the impact assessment process and the decision-making process, because we just don't have enough data and certainty that that is going to be effective. So that, going back to that mitigation hierarchy I spoke about, the most certain and the most cost-effective and safe thing to do is to make sure that wind turbines and wind farms are put in the right place in the first place.
Absolutely. Now I see Stephanie Cotter has jumped in and helped us with some of the decommissioning of wind farms requirements. So she's saying that a new environmental impact assessment is required in order to decommission wind energy facilities. Detailed decommissioning plans, including plans for the reuse, recycling, or disposal of all components, as well as rehabilitation of the site, would be required and would be developed in accordance with the legislation in force at the time of decommissioning, together with input from key stakeholders and interested and affected parties. Thanks, Stephanie, for jumping in, and it's great to know that there are plans in place for these decommissioning projects. Lynn Parrymore's asked us, Sam, what's the environmental impact that wind farms could have in the Grahamstown area?
Sure. That's kind of a broad question. I'm not sure whether she's asking about a specific wind farm or just in general. But impacts are quite site-specific. So I'm not sure if she's a developer or interested affected party. But I think that the safest bet would be for her to drop me an email with some more details, and I can chat to her about it.
Great. So Lynn, Sam's email there is energy@birdlife.org.za, in case you missed that earlier. Sam, I think that is just about all the questions we have for this evening. I'm not seeing any more. So I think with that was a marathon question session again. Thank you all so much for typing in your questions. I hope you've got some water or whiskey next to you, Sam.
I'm about to get some.
Good. I'd just like to thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. Really, really fascinating topic, and I certainly learned a lot as usual. And I think it's just so impressive the caliber of speakers that BirdLife is producing every single week. So to my colleagues, keep it up. And well done, Sam. That really was insightful and very interesting. I will see you all next week, Tuesday, It'll be me in the hot seat next week together with Dr. Lucy Kemp, and we're really looking forward to teaching you all about the Southern Ground Hornbill, our 2020 Bird of the Year. Please remember, you can get in touch with us on social media. You can also drop us an email at conversations@birdlife.org.za. And if you would like to know more about these webinars or BirdLife South Africa, hop on over to our website, www.birdlife.org.za. And we look forward to spending time with you all next week, Tuesday. Stay safe during lockdown. And remember, keep your eyes on the skies, look up and outside. There's birds all around us, and BirdLife South Africa plans to help keep those birds around for many years to come. Thanks, everybody. Good night.